Thank you for being
Okay.
here. As usual, I'm Sierra Salgado Parigi. I'm the Communications Director for Tri-Faith Initiative. And I'm really happy you're here for this final conversation. But yeah, if you'd just like to introduce yourself and what you're hoping to get from this last conversation.
I'm Barb Davis, and I'm from Countryside, and I'm just interested in
Good, thanks, Barb.
I'm Carrie Nath. I go to Urban Abbey and here have loved this group and also here to get action steps. What do we do now that we know?
Great, thank you. If it's easier for you to just maybe put your name and kind of what you're hoping to get out of tonight in the chat, you can feel free to do that as well.
Hi, I'm Chris Hammond, and I really enjoyed the book, and I've enjoyed the group, and I'm just, yeah, I'm not ready for it to end, but I'm looking for some action steps as well.
Good, and to that point about ending, at the end of tonight, we'll discuss maybe doing one more week just to kind of recap the entire book and have just a conversation about what we do. So be thinking about that as we go on tonight. Well, if you, if you decide throughout the time or hour today, if you want to let us know who you are, and you can keep it in the chat as well, but feel free to unmute yourself and introduce yourself as well. But we can go and get started. Tonight is the last night of the 5-week kind of official book study, and so we've had conversations with some community leaders, whether they're in the realtor like Angel Starks or federal government like Earl Redrick, or education, like Barry Thomas. And tonight we're fortunate to have Alexis Bromley with us, who's the director of One Omaha, which is the Office of Neighborhood Engagement. And so we'll hear from Alexis in a bit. But just to begin, Mike and I will go over kind of briefly at a high level, these last 2 chapters of the book are really about kind of to what a lot of you have said this evening. You're interested in kind of what action steps we can take in conversations that we can be having in our community. So we'll just kind of cover, again, at a high level, these last 2 chapters for a few minutes, and then kind of get some of your feedback on those 2 chapters as well. So in chapter 11, kind of just like looking back and looking forward, Rothstein is talking about things we've been discussing this during the study around how you might need to revise school district boundaries in order to create integration. He's talking about like ways that we can actively integrate communities, but is acknowledging that it's very difficult to undo residential segregation for a lot of reasons. But he's talking about just parents' economic status and how often that is passed down from one generation to another. And you have these 2 things kind of happening at the same time. You have government actively being involved in denying access to home ownership for African-American communities. At the same time, it provided more access and more opportunity for home ownership for white families. And so this these 2 kind of vicious cycles happening at the same time of white suburban home values going up with that access to ownership that they were provided, and after World War II especially. At the same time, you have neighborhoods with very kind of suppressed values and a lack of an opportunity to kind of pass down wealth. And so then he's talking about this kind of lack of vision for integrating into suburban communities and a lack of funding to do the same thing. And when there is some activity in integrating suburban communities through things like a tax credit project, it's almost universally met with opposition from the neighbors in those communities. And so it's talking about this idea of mobility, that families today have very limited mobility, in particular from their parents' income, as that's so tied to the choices as to where they can live and locate. And at the same time, a lack of increase of real wages over time for working families. And so sort of talking about the consequences of being exposed to poverty in a neighborhood, that often that's sometimes greater than the consequences of just being poor itself, that there's this very few role models in a neighborhood that maybe are academically or professionally been successful. There's a lack of housing opportunities where the air quality is the same as in kind of more suburban neighborhoods, and access to fresh food and public spaces, these things that, so he kind of ends the 11th chapter by asserting that this idea that segregation just sort of happened by accident, and it certainly happened by design. And so the actions of the government can't really be neutral about segregation. We either need to be, these policies are either exacerbating segregation or reversing it. And then he's talking about at the end of this chapter, using like the idea of the Section 8 housing choice voucher, that this is something that the government could enact, is to require a landlord to, if a housing Section 8 voucher is provided as a source of income for housing, that you should not be able to deny someone based on the source of their income. And currently in Omaha, and there are some places where that's the case, but in Omaha, that's not. Somebody could just, a homeowner that is wanting to rent their property, they could deny someone the opportunity to live in that house due to the source of that income that they have. So then he kind of moves into the last chapter and is talking about kind of what the problems have been created outside of just the issue of segregation, which is the very kind of polarizing politics that we have. There's a lack of civil discourse. And we see that through things like the dissimilarity index, which is just a way of understanding how likely are you to, in a day-to-day environment, in your kind of everyday activities, how likely are you to interact with someone that is not like you from a race or ethnicity standpoint. And in Omaha, we are, we're one of the most segregated, but also one of the most segregated in this idea of interacting with people that that are not like you through race or ethnicity. Like Little Rock, Arkansas, and Omaha are like kind of vying for the top place of cities of our size. So then he's talking about schools and the opportunity we have to change the textbooks and teaching about white supremacy and helping kind of connect the dots as to the problems that we have. And by doing so, he's trying to help us understand that if you think that segregation and that this sort of happened by accident, or just the kind of private transactions between private citizens, that it might be easy for you to think that this can just be reversed by change of hearts of individuals. But instead, if we acknowledge that our local and state and federal government was actively involved in segregating our communities, then we could, instead of opening our hearts or believing that people could just have a personal change, we might open our minds to the possibilities of how the government from a local, state, and federal level can be a part of adopting kind of aggressive policies to desegregate. And so then he kind of moves to some recommendations, and the one that I thought was most interesting, the first one that he talks about, he's sort of using this example as a point of saying this would probably never pass, but it would frame the kind of conversations that we have to have. And so he uses in New York City as an example. So in New York, 15% of the population is African American. So in that case, the next 15% of the homes that come up for sale in New York, that the government should be involved in purchasing those homes actively and then selling those homes to African Americans at a housing value to what their grandparents would have likely paid for that same house. And then sort of after that, we're talking about some policy changes around banning exclusionary single-family zoning, which we have in this unicameral right now. There's a bill in Lincoln, LB 492, that is talking about how we could, is it possible to ban just single-family zoning as a for a city, and at the same time of not only banning exclusionary zoning, also at the same time working on inclusionary zoning, so that as a community develops, that you might have a certain percentage of homes or rental opportunities in that development that are for low to moderate income families. And then to end these actions, he's saying that if a lot of homeowners, most homeowners, they take advantage of deducting the interest from their mortgage on their taxes. So unless you are, as a community, actively trying to attract low to moderate income housing into your neighborhoods, if you're not doing that, then you are exempt. You're not able to deduct that interest from your taxes. And so at the end of that, he kind of ends with a question, kind of bringing it back to the people in Levittown and the Stevensons in California, and really asking, what do we as an American community owe to families like the Stevensons for the lack of opportunity that they had? And so then asking, not only what do we owe them, but what do we owe their future generations for that loss of opportunity, and how might we fulfill that obligation? So that's just a couple highlights of the last two chapters. And before we kind of get into a little bit of conversation around these chapters, I do, and Mike's thoughts as well, I do want to share with you a 50-second clip that was on last week with John Oliver, a show on HBO, just on Sunday. And this clip is actually a clip from 1958 in Levittown, which is this town that we've been profiling throughout this entire book. So I'm going to just share my screen here. Can you all see this YouTube clip right now? You can all see that? I can't see you, so you can? Okay. Yeah. And let's see. Okay, so we're just gonna play a little bit of this. This is an interview with someone that is, in their opinion, as to this opportunity to integrate a neighborhood in Levittown. So here we go.
The country. In fact, just listen to this woman in Levittown, Pennsylvania, explain her objections to a black family moving to town in 1957 with some real honesty.
We like the advantages that Levittown seemed to offer in comparison to other cities. And we understood that it was going to be all white. We were very happy to buy a home here.
Do you think a Negro family moving here will affect the community as a whole?
Definitely. The whole trouble with this integration business is that in the end, it probably will end up with mixing socially. And you'll have, well, I think their aim is mixed marriages and becoming equal with the whites.
Wow. It is always weird to hear someone, whether or not they look like some.
So we'll stop there, and just wanted to share that because we, this so much of our discussion and the stories in the book, they can seem somewhat disconnected to us when it's just words on a page, but to see someone in this case black and white, just very explicitly explain this and recognize that this is not unique to her or to that community, but to us, and it's still happening today. We through some of our elected leaders, and at a very overt way, but also in some ways very covertly. And so I just wanted to share that as a way of sort of grounding us in our conversation, not only for tonight, but moving ahead. So I'll stop there and see if Mike has any thoughts on the last couple chapters before we bring it up to you all.
Yeah, I don't really have a terrible large amount to add. I mean, I think a lot of the themes that we've talked about through the last several weeks kind of come together and kind of culminate in the last couple chapters here. I do think sort of one of the interesting pieces about, some of what we've talked about with the civil rights movement in the 60s and the Fair Housing Act, and how, that's been kind of seen as like a culminating act of ending discrimination, that really left undone ending segregation. And in many ways, how the sort of level playing field that has existed from like a legal standpoint since 1968 has really kind of perpetuated this myth of sort of de facto segregation, that anybody who could choose can choose. And so I think, it's interesting to kind of see how all of that, how those pieces have come together. And again, the central sort of idea of the book about how as a country, we really had all of these government actions really culminating and weaving together to really create and foster segregation in our communities, and that it really is going to take a similar kind of response to undo this work, and that the scale of the problem is something that doesn't look like tax credits on a small basis. And I think too, his meditation on the idea of what we think of as entitlements in our country, whether it's a Section 8 voucher, how many communities don't even have enough Section 8 vouchers to meet the needs and the requests that come in, whereas anybody who owns a home can get a mortgage interest tax deduction. And like this notion that what we cap, what we see as an entitlement versus what we see as things that anyone can have and anyone is deserving of, is sort of an interesting idea, particularly when sort of the ability to own a home has been so limited for many people in our country. And so I'll leave it there. But I think the last two chapters, it's kind of nice to hear some of his thoughts on, what some of the steps forward are, but they are not easy. And I think they're not without really, really sort of drastic changes to how people think about policy.
Any other thoughts from anyone here tonight on these last two chapters? And I think we have, this is like the right topic, these last two chapters, to have Alexis with us tonight. So really looking forward to what Alexis has to say as well. But before we, unless you're like, I don't want to say anything, I just want to get to what Alexis has to say, and that is more than fine too. Oh, okay, Alexis, you're up. So Alexis Bromley, like I said, is the director of One Omaha, and I'll let Alexis talk about background and interest and sort of what you're seeing from the community, both locally and then what you've been kind of exposed to and seen work elsewhere. And you have this chapter, Rothstein is talking about this opening up people's minds to the imaginations as to what it might take to undo what's from the past. So we're eager to hear from you and your sort of, in some ways, would say like as a prophetic imagination to what we might see in the future, in a very radical kind of turn from where we've been. So this is Alexis.
Yes. Hello. Good afternoon. Good evening. Sorry. Good evening. I'm used to doing these during the workday, but here I am hanging out with you and excited. My name is Alexis Bromley. I am the director of a local nonprofit called One Omaha. I will give a little bit of background about me as myself. I think it's valuable to learn about your speaker, as well as I have empathy as one of my top strengths. So just understanding where people come from is always good to know. I am born and raised in Omaha. This is home to me, and The Color of Law is a very intriguing and personal book for me because I grew up in suburban West Omaha, because that's what my parents, or that is what my mom specifically thought was the best life that she could give her kids after growing up in housing projects. And to talk a little bit about my family history that I recently discovered, probably within the past couple years by interviewing my grandparents and my parents and just getting to know their life story. My grandmother was born in Omaha, and they lived off of like 33rd and Burdett. And this was probably about the 1950s, 1940s. She was born, 1950s is when she lived in the area. But she moved into the first wave of housing, low-income housing developments in Omaha. And so that took place about the 1940s in North Omaha, is where they raised about acres and acres of land to build 3 housing units. So they built Hilltop housing projects, they built Pleasant View housing projects, and they built Spencer Homes projects. And of those today, Spencer Homes is still standing. Hilltop was torn down in the 90s, Pleasant View was torn down in the early 2000s, and Spencer Homes has plans for demolition to take place over the next couple of years. And so to show that a lot of these systems are still in place today, as well as we still have people living within those same structures that just keep them in poverty and depressed. So my grandmother, she moved into Pleasant View housing projects in the 1950s, and it was a very joyous moment for her. She said it was the first time that she ever had running water in a house. It was the first time that they were able to just have this home with 2 bedrooms and a bathroom to share instead of having multiple people live within the home, as well as they had more of a sense of community. And the original intention of public housing projects was to do just that, create affordable housing for people who didn't have the means to afford it. And that was my grandmother's situation. However, as my grandmother stayed there because of limited opportunities that she did not realize at the time, as economics were shifting within North Omaha and jobs were locating outside, or as transportation was starting to really alter and change as the streetcar shut down in the 1960s. All of these things took place over generations as my grandma was situated here that also affected my mom as her upbringing as well. And so my grandma had a joyous experience as she moved in, as I mentioned, but then my mother had a much different experience living in public housing projects, and that goes towards that generational thing. They weren't intentionally meant to be generational and trap people into poverty, but unfortunately that was the consequence of what they did. So as my mom grew up in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, she had a very troubled childhood because that's when it was more so of fragmented families. That's more so of when violence was starting to take place closer to the 1980s, not necessarily the 60s and 70s. And she was not able to go to really high quality schools. The schools that my mom had the ability to attend growing up in those neighborhoods are still in the bottom performing schools in the state of Nebraska to this day. And so if you think about every single family that has gone through living in these units and attending these schools, there is very limited opportunity for them to escape that cycle. My mom was the oldest of 5 siblings. She raised all of her siblings, and as soon as she graduated from high school, she went to Peru State College, and she was the first generation college student and happened to graduate there, and then come back to me, 3rd generation that I'm talking about. She wanted to live in the suburbs because that is where the economic opportunity was. That is where historically people in my family were excluded from living in. And so that sense of American dream and success to her was allowing and affording that opportunity for her kids. So that is in a very detailed example of just one family and how public housing projects affected us, and how the resources of the community that my mother grew up in were not adequate enough for her to also raise her future kids there and her family. The plot twist of the story is I now live at the site of Pleasant View housing projects where my mom grew up. It's now the Highlander neighborhood that is a new mixed income community down here. And when I first told my mom that I was looking to move down here and rent a home, her immediate thought was, why? Why would you go back to that place? Why would you move back down to 30th and Parker? I could tell you every single story I have from my childhood on why she wanted to get me and my sister out of here and not grow up in the same place that she did. However, the things that are taking place now to try to reverse the effects of housing discrimination and concentrated poverty is the neighborhood that I'm living in right now. And it's something that I believe deeply in, as well as the amenities of our community to be able to live within a Black neighborhood and still have opportunities and still have access is very limited for Omaha. And so that is what drew me back to my neighborhood. And I am happy to say that my mom is completely on board, and she loves the neighborhood that I'm living in now and seeing it change over the generations and years. And hopefully it continues to do that. I discovered my passion for just, I'm a master's student right now at UNO, and I'm getting my master's in urban studies. And so cities and how they affect people just fascinate me, as well as how vice versa, on the contrary, how people also affect cities and that aspect of it. And so I really want to hear from everyone. I'm a social person, so I really want to open this up to the recommendations that Rothstein added in there, and what recommendations piqued your interest. What recommendations would you have never thought of, but it made complete sense to you? And what recommendations do you think would be very, very hard, but worthwhile to pursue in a city like Omaha to implement?
One of the things that has struck me is, like the neighborhood that you apparently live in that I don't know much about, is mixed income communities. Why is it that when we develop 160 acres out in West Omaha, is it exclusively $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 homes? And why can't the laws and the zoning situations be developed so that a developer has to include a wide range of income and cost in that neighborhood?
Love that, Paul. Thank you for sharing that. I agree.
How did your neighborhood come about to be mixed income?
Yeah, so I live in the Highlander neighborhood, which has the boundaries of 30th and Lake to 30th and Hamilton. And this came about because there was an intentional organization that focused on the neighborhood. It was not organic. It was very much a purpose-driven initiative to try and reverse the effects of what public housing had done to this area for the past, since the 1940s when they were developed. And the company, the organization that focuses on it is called 75 North, and they focus on breaking the cycle of poverty at a systemic level. And the way that they do that is mixed income housing, so making sure that it's affordable housing for people to live here, as well as individuals with disposable incomes who necessarily could live in anywhere in Omaha but may choose to live here for the amenities that are offered. They focus on high quality education. As I mentioned, many of the schools in this neighborhood are severely underperforming. And what does that look like when the children within this neighborhood are surviving or struggling and then going to school every day and then receiving an adequate education? They are not being prepared for life. And to me, I think education is one of the largest anti-poverty campaigns or initiatives that we have within our country. And lastly, they focus on economic opportunity as well. And that to them is their model of how to break the cycle of poverty within families. And that's one model to focus on that they use here. And it was a 8-year project to get this housing development in place, but it required a lot of funding, and it required a lot of philanthropic funding, unfortunately. And that is where you don't want to go with housing developments, because it is not the role of philanthropists to fill the housing needs for humans and people within our community. That is very much what our government and what our city and our state should be focusing on as their responsibilities. But it costs a lot of money. The neighborhood I live in, it was $100 million. And there were tax credits that were used. LIHTC was one of the ones that was mentioned. There was TIF financing that was used as well. And I can elaborate on any of those. Please just let me know. And even with all of the financing and tax credits, there still was a gap in funding to create more affordable housing units for people here. And there remains a gap. There's vacant land all around my neighborhood waiting for additional money to grow and develop on. However, this is not a viable place per se where you can get loans or where you can get that asset, where you can get that capital to grow it, because when you look at the matrix of financing and bankers, it doesn't seem feasible for them, so it's not worth the risk. It's an institution and a system within itself. What other recommendations did our questions?
Alexis, you've brought up amenities a couple of times in the neighborhood, and I'm curious how you might think we could change that so that we don't have to, rely on private philanthropy for something that is an amenity, but it also change the idea of this isn't an amenity, it's just a right to have, and that the public would have an interest and an investment in providing those amenities. Just curious to get your thoughts on. Those might be bike lanes, parks, everything we're talking about.
Yeah, it's so there's a model of growth called smart growth, and that is a very recent term that I'm coming to understand. And what smart growth is, it is dictating how cities continue to grow and develop. And so, Paul, you mentioned that Western expansion is prominent in Omaha, and the fact of the matter is Omaha does not place restrictions on developing land outside of the city. It is looked at more so as a revenue generator when that tax base comes back in. So it's an economic opportunity for them. When we look at the cities that exist or the neighborhoods that exist within our city that are depressed, and they also have low property and tax values, in the event that Omaha were to restrict expanding Western, then North Omaha and South Omaha would be the immediate places that developers would then come in and start to scoop up land because of how cheap it would be to develop onto. And then that's when gentrification happens. And so you always want to have the goal of development without displacing the people who live there. And that is a very hard thing to balance without policy in place requiring it, because developers want to earn as much money as they can and get their biggest return on investment. That is why they're in the business. But when you build affordable housing, there is this gap in financing that you're not able to charge that premium. And so where is that subsidized cost going to come from? And that is also where developers look for the city or maybe the government to create that subsidy. A couple things that I think could work great for Omaha is requiring all rental properties in Omaha accept housing vouchers. I do not believe that should be up to the landlord to decide, because then that is still upholding racist and classist policies within our system. Another thing that I think that we have the ability to create is some sort of affordable housing fund for developers who do want to create that affordable housing, but need that gap to get it done, especially in places that are not in lower income tracts in North and South Omaha. But how can we get more affordable housing in Northwest Omaha and Southwest Omaha and around Dodge Street, where there are more opportunities for people to thrive? And so I like Color of Law because Rothstein really communicates how it's not a singular initiative that can solve it, but there are so many barriers and there are so many systems in place that you have to move and address in order to get it there. But he had really, really good ones. For Omaha, the ones that he mentioned were the mandates on a percentage of all new developments have to be affordable. And that is something that is very realistic for our city to do. We have infill development taking place all over Omaha. There are more apartment units being created, as well as with the new transportation system on Dodge Street, there will be even more density taking place. And so all of those new units, they should require them, one, that a certain percentage of them is affordable, and two, that they're not all studio and one bedroom apartments, because that is keeping away families. That is going to only keep younger people there, as well as those who have the means to afford it. And it's not aging in place. Everybody does not have the ability to live there. And I believe in choice. And so if the developer chooses to opt out of that percentage of the housing, then they could buy out those and put it into that fund that then goes into funding future affordable housing developments. And so they get charged maybe double or a fee that goes into a pot of money that is then distributed to the community to grow more. But that does not address education. That does not address accessibility to parks. That does not address economic opportunities either.
Alexis? I have two questions. I'm really glad to learn about 75 North. I've been trying to follow it, but I just didn't catch all of what was going on. So Highlander Homes is part of that project, that development, 75 North? Do I
Yes.
understand that?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I heard, and I just don't know if it's, I've not heard much, but is our schools, or at least I thought one of the schools, public schools, was involved as part of that development. Is there something going on there with?
Correct. Yes.
Can you talk to that?
Yes. So one thing, as we mentioned schools, 75 North was able to form a partnership with Omaha Public Schools where they could provide additional resources and requirements and training for instructors and teachers at a local elementary school. In Nebraska, charter schools are illegal. And so in most cases, what would have happened is there would have been a charter school that would have been given attention and resources that reflect the needs of the community. But that's not the case for Omaha. So they had to go a unique route and created a partnership with OPS, with Howard Kennedy Elementary, and they were able to hire a new principal. They were able to hire, all the staff had to reapply for their jobs. And then the standards of curriculum for the students were increased dramatically, as well as the training for teachers on dealing with systems of poverty and the children who navigate through it. That was also increased.
Okay, thank you. I had heard a little bit about that, but no one definitely told me for sure. So now I know for sure. The second thing is there in the process a new development now that 75 North, is it finished or still in the process? And is there, I thought I heard there was a new development after 75 North that was going to happen.
I would say 75 North is about a third of the way at the capacity of what they can deliver. But it comes down to funding. There's not available funding to do more. And like multi-million-dollar projects type funding.
And philanthropic funds are not what you want? Is that what you're saying?
And so that is, right now, our philanthropic community is doing a housing study for Omaha to decide how they can strategically allocate resources to help with affordable housing. And of that is, I think the conversation came from 75 North because that project happened specifically because of philanthropy, but that can't be the model moving forward because it's not sustainable.
Okay.
Barbara, one thing you might have heard about was the Spencer Homes project that the city of Omaha received about, I think, like a $30 million grant from the Department of Housing and Urban Development to, it's at 30th and Spencer, so it's a little bit north of the Highlander development, but it was supposed to build on some of the momentum that Alexis is talking about, and that might be part of it.
What? Say that again. It's supposed to do what? Build on the momentum of the 75.
Right. Yeah. And so Spencer Homes, as Alexis mentioned, is another one of these public housing properties, and so they're taking a look at that site and if something can be done similar to what had been done at Highlander, but yeah, kind of a different model, more city-led. But a similar type of approach.
That's probably what I've heard a little bit about then. Spencer housing project, is that what it is? Is it going to be torn down?
It will be replaced with mixed income community.
Okay, that's probably what I'm thinking of. I was a teacher in North Omaha for years with OPS, so I have a lot of interest in what's happening.
Yeah. I'll go ahead, Jeff.
Well, I have a question for you. So this book is a couple of years old, but it's impossible not to read it, the book again, like in one hand, and not think about the headlines and what we're going through right now, and kind of read it through the lens of what's going on right now. So we have this kind of public health pandemic problem, right? But it isn't in isolation. We know it just like in neighborhood development and such, that there's a lot of factors that are interdependent upon each other. So it's not only public health, it's like embed, like it's intersecting with race and gender. So the book, these chapters talk about, and the conversation so far have been, large scale, like we need elected officials and things to do this. I'm curious from you though, because One Omaha recently started a mini grant program that's really geared towards addressing the issues of right now, but in a grassroots effort. So question is twofold. One, what are some of those projects that kind of give you hope that could scale up? And then two, the people on this call tonight are from all throughout Omaha. And so what tools do you think like that we could all have that would help to change some of these kind of conversations and things in our own communities?
I would be happy to. Projects in Omaha that give me hope are the 75 North. I'm still very passionate about the work that they're doing. From 75 North, since the first phase of that project was successful, then they created a separate organization to lead the same neighborhood in South Omaha called Southside Redevelopment Organization. And I will be Southside Redevelopment Association, Southside Redevelopment Corporation will be replacing, their goal is to replace the Southside Terrace housing development in South Omaha, which is the largest we have here today with over, I think, 400 units of people that are living there in housing projects that were built in the 1940s and 50s. And so just imagine the conditions and the neighborhood of what it looks like after, what is that, 70, 60, 70, 80 years of being a depressed community. It's just, yeah, it's heartbreaking. However, it does give me hope that there is people out here looking to create those changes within Omaha. Another one is something as simple as the Missing Middle Housing campaign, and just the drive to get more duplexes and fourplex apartments into neighborhoods that maybe somebody can only afford half of a house in or a fourth of a house in, but they still really value that neighborhood and see it as a great place for them to live. They should be able to have that opportunity to locate there. Another one that gets me excited, of course, is Orbit. Rothstein really talked on transportation and how the lack of transportation available in these historically segregated communities do not allow for people to access economic opportunities or jobs, and it creates barriers for them. And if you just think of the way that Omaha is set up, yes, we have our downtown core, which historically has been where the job center is, but then we also have Mutual of Omaha in Midtown, and Kiewit is in Midtown. Then we have HDR in Exarban. We had TD Ameritrade that was in the old mill area. And we just have this huge sprawl of all of these large corporations. Another one is PayPal in La Vista, which would be a lot of entry-level jobs for people. All of these job centers are growing in places where it is very hard to access if you do not have a car. And so something as simple as just providing additional transportation for the city makes it more equitable in that aspect of it. It doesn't solve it all, but it's a step towards making sure that we could at least make some progress towards getting there. I'm very excited about those three projects. Tools to help. I will speak a little bit about One Omaha here. And One Omaha exists to really support people, everyday people, to create change on a neighborhood level. And the reason why One Omaha came about is because there was a need for neighborhood leaders to feel supported, to be able to have resources and tools to create change that they want to see. And so if you think of anything in your neighborhood that could possibly improve the quality of life, not only for you, but also for your neighbors, that is where One Omaha comes into play. And how can we really coach and mentor people to create that change? How can we provide training for them to become leaders within their community? And then how can we create that process for them to be successful in navigating the systems or whatever resources that they need to access in order to create it? We have a really difficult time, and I'm happy I could speak to you about it right now. We have a difficult time at One Omaha because historically we have served neighborhood associations, but as this book has pointed out, neighborhood associations historically have been exclusive of people of color, different incomes, renters. I think in the earlier chapters, Rothstein talks about the school PTA meeting where people wore I'm a homeowner on their shirts. Yeah. And so we support grassroots organizing. However, most of the needs that we have are in communities that are still segregated to today. People are looking for resources to help their neighbors. People are looking for resources to create change, to just do something that their neighborhood can look different than what it is today. And so we are here, we're that middle person to support them between the systems of change and within themselves, and we guide them on that path. However, as I mentioned, neighborhood associations is who we have historically served, but they are not inclusive of people. And so we are trying to figure out right now, what is that medium that people are now looking to create neighborhood change? Because young people aren't joining neighborhood associations. They are not even owning homes, but they are enacting change and they are advocates for that community change. And so our organization has to pivot a little bit to figure out what is that channel of communication, or what is that medium of change that they are now taking to create that on a neighborhood scale. Yeah.
Thank you. About others here, other questions in the group?
I guess I'm along those lines, Alexis, and thank you so much for being here tonight. It's just such great information, and it's great to hear from you. So what, like I live in the Joslyn, I just moved to the Joslyn neighborhood area, right? Mm-hmm. So what can I do to help you? Like, what do you need? And what can I do in my community? I also moved here and then COVID hit, and it's like, you go knock on your neighbor's door and it's like through the door crack of like, hey, okay, yeah, don't breathe on me, So what can I do to help you? What can we do to help you along those lines?
I will say Jocelyn Castle is a great neighborhood to move into. I attended their neighborhood meeting last year, and they were very forthcoming about, do we have renters on our board? And they did not. And that was something that they wanted to dedicate effort into, creating more representation of renters. And so something like that, just what do you have the power to question? What do you have the power to influence in terms of a neighborhood association or a group of individuals within your community? Because NIMBYism, which means not in my backyard, that is what happens when affordable housing opportunities come up in places like West Omaha. You now have these communities coming together and saying, we don't want low-income people here, and then stereotyping A, B, C, D, E on why that is. And so you all have done the incredible work of taking the step one of education, and that is reading this book. And that's a huge step to even take within itself. And I would say the next one is have those conversations. As Rothstein mentioned, he would love to see a middle and high school curriculum on housing segregation. Do you know middle and high schoolers? Have you talked to them? Do they understand what you know now, or have you communicated? Because many of you are older than me in here, and this may be the first time that you have dove in depth to understanding it. And so think about the individuals who are younger and who have the ability now and the energy, frankly, to create change. And what is the information knowledge that they need to know about that? And this book is something that you can use as a tool to have those conversations and to challenge people if they exert their biases into conversations with you. Carrie, I think another great one to implement is, let's see, supporting local businesses is always as simple as it can get. They have to thrive within communities that, as you have seen, have very high wealth disparities. And so if you have that additional income, if you have disposable income where that is not an issue for you, it is always good to support other businesses or nonprofits who are doing the work of this in the nature. If you see things into the news, always contact your local reps and support or against certain policies that could either uphold further housing segregation or even dismantle housing segregation. And just to hear from different people who don't necessarily experience it and live it every day, because those aren't often the voices who get centered at the table when talking about it. But would your voice be centered? Would your voice be heard? Would your voice be something that people would stop and listen to? And if it is, how do you plan to use it?
So Alexis, there's a question in the chat from former guest speaker here, Angel Starks.
Hey, Angel.
So I'll read in Angel's voice. Hi, Alexis. Always a pleasure to share a space with you. My question is, how do we better educate and prepare future homeowners instead of continuing an opportunity like subsidies and et cetera of lifelong renters?
I love this. So one of the things with generational wealth is homes. That is a house. That is an asset to not only you, but also to previous generations within your family, or maybe even potential generations in your family. For example, my mom escaped poverty. She was a first generation college student. She bought a home, and my sister is recently looking to buy another home, and my mom was able to talk her through how she can use the equity of her house as a down payment on another one. I'm not a homeowner, so I don't know, but I hope it makes sense. Okay, I got nods. And so even just having that type of knowledge and understanding and education is something that people who do not know a lot of people who own homes, or maybe their parents don't own homes, they don't have any of those resources that everyone else had access to with learning how to do first-time home buying. And so education is always a huge, huge thing, but also I think home ownership should be a goal for people, whether it is a single family home or a duplex or a condo, but just generating that wealth and building those resources and assets within yourself allows you to escape places or have that collateral that you would not have had before. To do that, Angel, it's very hard to pursue home ownership with wealth disparities. And that is what kind of stops me in my tracks from, I don't know how to better educate people, because if they are living paycheck to paycheck and can only save $50 a month, it's not realistic for them to think that they can save up for a 20% down payment on a home. And so what are those resources? And one of them within our community is Family Housing Advisory Services. That is, they work with individuals on over a 2-year process on how to prepare them to purchase a home. But that is something that only I know about. Not only I, but it comes from word of mouth is what I'm trying to say. And I don't know, Angel, that's a great question. Does anyone have any thoughts on it?
I don't necessarily have an answer. I kind of have a far off in the future, how great would the world be if some policy changes could happen type of discussion that probably isn't very realistic. But something in the second to last chapter of the book that I kept kind of coming back to and reflecting on is how he kept saying that these policies that were put into place in the 60s to try and reverse things would have been successful, but they were put into place too late. And how in theory they would help reverse something that has been done, but it was just too late. And I feel looking at policies down the track that are coming up even in our legislature and across the whole country, that we're just going to be doing that again, and things are going to be coming up too late. So I keep circling back to restitution, kind of what Jeff was saying at the beginning, that example in New York that he listed, of how do you prepare future homeowners and get those educational opportunities when they aren't in the position that they can afford it. And so I keep circling back to restitution, and I think what got me interested in urban studies and urban planning in general is this idea that the government does need to make up for the mistakes that they made, specifically by from the government to the community directly that has been affected, making up for what was done and providing restitution so that those families and those individuals can come back up. So I think that idea in the book of him kind of saying that these policies were too late, I keep coming back to, and it's the question that we all kind of ask ourselves and have been asking through this entire book club, but it was interesting in that chapter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's yeah. Thank you for sharing.
Alexis, we're getting close to 8 o'clock. So kind of one last question. The book, especially the last couple of chapters, really talks about this. It's going to take more than just a change of hearts and minds. It takes policy. So if I'm a policymaker, if I'm governor, mayor, council member, and I call you, Alexis, what's like the one thing I should prioritize? And given the agency that I have as an elected official to undo segregation, like what would you say?
I would support any projects that are asking for public funding to make it happen have to have affordable housing mandates within it. And if it's not affordable housing mandates, then economic opportunities tied to it. For example, tax increment financing was used all over the Blackstone neighborhood. And that is, you want development, you want revitalization, but to me, it has to go one step further to ensuring that next step. So if you say we're going to pass this law, and then what? So we're going to pass TIF financing, and then we're going to support this Blackstone development, and then what? And for me, that question would have been, how many people are you going to employ at all of these shops and businesses from the neighborhood that you are putting into it? And can the baristas at the coffee shop even afford to live and walk to work within the neighborhood that they are working within? And so, Jeff, you as our mayor, as our politician, I would say to always ask, okay, and then what? So you're going to do this, and then what? Because it is not enough to just do one thing. You have to make sure that you are being equitable in every part of the process and thinking about empathetically how it affects everyone at play.
That's really good. And that's great. And the empathy piece that you just touched on has been like the theme from like everything you've been talking about tonight. And it's a really good way to kind of circle back to that this book and these issues are not, I mean, they are about policy and laws, but ultimately these are people in neighborhoods and families in houses. And so that's understanding their stories and listening and finding solutions and speaking on behalf of the people that you represent. And that's a challenge for all of us to think about our actions. And so it's really appreciate you doing that and connecting us through the telling of the story of your family and really helping us see kind of through that lens and grounding and humanizing our conversation tonight. So really appreciate that. And
congrats everyone who read the book or who's planning to. You even get kudos.
Yeah. Well, thank you again. So this is at 8 o'clock and this is the last week, but we'll send out to you all two things: a poll, like a survey, what you liked about this, like what you've learned and so on. And then also, we've had someone come and speak to us each week, and we just want to do one last bonus week for next week, the 11th, same time. We'll get a different Zoom link because we might need to have someone else run it. But just to kind of recap the entire book and talk about what we want to do about that. So if you can make it, great. If you committed to 5 weeks and that's all you wanted to do, that's okay too. So but you've registered tonight, so you have our information. So we have yours, so we'll be sending out an email to you with the survey and a link for next week. Does that sound okay? Yeah. All right. Thumbs up. Great.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.